Joining me now on the desk is Claire Lehmann, the founding editor of Quillette magazine. Good to see you again, Claire.
Hi, Chris.
I've got to talk to you about the changing face of the media and the way it plays into this misinformation legislation that Canberra's trying to foist upon us. First up, you made a great speech earlier this year about how the media has changed, how social media and digital media has changed everything, basically because the media is just looking for clicks all the time. Has it inhibited quality? Has it dumbed us all down?
Yeah, so there was an interesting study that came out late last year that showed that headlines denoting anger, fear and disgust have all risen dramatically over the past 10 years, and headlines denoting neutrality or joy have all decreased. And one theory for this change in emotional content is that social media, which distributes our content, is driving, it rewards anger and outrage over other emotions such as happiness or, cooler emotions. Yep. So because we get addicted to outrage and because stories that provoke our outrage do quite well, media companies then it becomes a feedback loop where media companies keep publishing stuff that gets us all outraged. Then we respond to the outrage and it becomes this kind of vicious cycle.
People would say that that's been a dynamic in the media forever, but when there was just old-fashioned print newspapers and television. But I suppose you're saying this is accelerated or amplified in social media?
Yeah, and I would say that's true. It has always been a trend in media. I mean, there's that phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Yeah. So it's been going for a long time, but social media has just amplified what has already been there and has just ratcheted up a notch to the point where we're getting these sort of toxic side effects such as hyperpolarisation and, poor mental health outcomes.
We are much more polarised when it comes to political debate or public debate. It's not all politics, of course, all sorts of social and other issues. Yeah. But we are demonstrably more polarised than we were 20 years ago, aren't we?
Yeah, you could say that we're becoming more tribal.
Yeah.
And the country where this is most stark is obviously the United States, where issues aren't really assessed on their merits and people don't look at policies on a case-by-case basis. But if it's my team, then I'm for it. If it's perceived to be on your team, then I'm against it. And it's just this kind of tribal mentality, which is, going backwards. And
as you say, it follows what's happened in the US. Is that inevitable then, that we're just going to go down the same path, or is there any way to arrest it?
I hope not. And, we have all sorts of protective factors. Our culture is quite different in many ways, but they are a bit of a warning sign. The way that polarisation means that, neighbours don't get along and people don't marry unless they're, Democrats don't marry Republicans and Republicans won't marry Democrats. It's like the worst thing in the world. I hope we don't go down that path. I really do.
Yeah, although the signs aren't good. Now, of course, on the social media, we know there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of abuse. There are a lot of conspiracy theories. But we pick our way through it, presumably, most of us.
Yeah.
We make those choices. We're increasingly seeing the push from government to intervene. We know that our own federal government intervened with the digital giants during COVID to try and censor a lot of information that was available online. And with this new legislation, we're looking at the federal government through ACMA giving itself the power to censor all sorts of information, with the government deciding what's true and what's not. Yeah. Surely that's a recipe for disaster.
It is. And, I've written about misinformation. I do think it's a problem, but the government coming in to try and police it is one of the worst ideas I've ever heard. I mean, that's what authoritarian, tyrannical governments do. We have academic debates where scientists disagree with each other. I mean, that's the nature of scholarly debate, is disagreement. And over time, through doing experimentation and debating and nutting through issues, you come to some kind of consensus. But this takes a long time. The idea that a bureaucrat can step in and suddenly determine the truth on all sorts of hot topics, on controversial issues, is insane.
Well, very complex issues where there is not a black and white answer. It might be how to deliver affordable, reliable energy with minimal emissions. It might be the actual science of what's happening with climate change. It might be how best to deal with gender dysphoric children. I mean, how can we allow a government authority to decide what's actually acceptable and what's not?
It's insane. And a lot of these issues that we disagree with each other on are moral issues. So there is no objective truth. It's quite subjective. And the idea that the government is somehow going to be able to, tell us what is misinformation or disinformation is really quite... I'm surprised that such a bill has even gotten up for consultation.
Yeah, I'm surprised the government, the Labor government, is even proposing it. Now, the issue, we know there's problems, we know there's misinformation, we know there's abuse, pornography, all sorts of stuff. And there might be ways for us to manage that as individuals or as organisations, but surely it's better to have all sorts of angles of that merging in social media and people working it out for themselves than the alternative of having some imposed censorship, which by its very nature is going to be obscure.
Yeah, any kind of top-down approach to censorship doesn't work. It generally backfires and it will make people more suspicious of institutions, not less suspicious. And that's the problem that the government is trying to deal with, is this distrust of institutions. But you can't solve that through top-down censorship. You can only solve it by putting out more information, being transparent, having mechanisms for correction. So a good example of a mechanism for correction is the new feature on Twitter called Twitter Notes.
Right.
So users who see a tweet that's inaccurate can add a note. And so you can see all sorts of interesting corrections on really ridiculous tweets, but it's crowdsourced fact-checking. And it works.
Sure, a lot of the notes themselves will be incorrect. I know that whatever I said on Twitter, there'd be lots of notes correcting me anyway, but at least it's a debate, right?
You might be surprised.
Now, just very briefly, because we're nearly out of time, but you mentioned the impact of all this on mental health.
Yeah.
How does that occur?
Well, I think that, there's a lot of doom and gloom in media. And for people who are consuming a lot of media, particularly young people who might be... seeing headlines about climate change every single day, the climate crisis. And, it's not always healthy for us to focus on things that we can't control. So if we're being exposed to headlines day in and day out about things we can't control, such as the climate, and many other issues are out of our hands as well, it can lead to sort of a feeling of not having an internal locus of control, not being in control of our own lives and our own environment, which I don't think is healthy long term. Yeah,
indeed. And we've talked about that a bit in the past with Claire Rowe, how that impacts on kids in particular.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Claire. Appreciate it.